Feel free to chat questions throughout so that Pamela can yell them out to me in real time because I want to answer everybody's questions. So yeah, I started Natural Earth Paint about 12 years ago, and we manufacture all eco-friendly, professional quality, non-toxic art supplies. We also have a full range for children's kits and supplies and natural face paints and a lot of stuff. So check us out on our website, naturalearthpaint.com. We have a huge resources section with tons of recipes, probably over 100 recipes for how to make different types of natural paint and pastels and crayons and pottery and house paint and everything you could think of. So check that out. So today we're going to talk about watercolor and gouache, which are so easy to make. I think probably number one easy is oil paint and number two is watercolor. It's so quick and easy. And there's so many benefits to making them yourself as opposed to just buying pans in a store. One is non-toxic, so you are sure what's in it. You know that there's no carcinogens or toxins or additives in what you're making. A few years ago, I was in an art supply store and I was looking at the pans of watercolor paint, and I was really surprised that quite a few of them had carcinogenic warnings wrapped around because of the pigment. So it's super great that they had those warnings on there, but it was actually surprising how many different colors had the carcinogenic warning. So if you're making your own paint with natural, non-toxic pigments, you know that it just has honey, gum arabic, which is tree sap, and natural pigment, and that's it. Super pure. And the quality, you can completely determine the quality if you mix your own paint. You can have really highly pigmented paints. You control how much pigment goes in. So it's not student grade. There's no bulking agents or fillers. You can have a very high quality professional paint. I actually did a test years ago where I painted swatches of my handmade paint next to a professional tubed watercolor paint, and you could just see it. You could just see it was so much more radiant and luminous, the handmade paints. So that's a really great bonus. Another thing is, super affordable. It's so crazy how affordable it is to make your own paint. You'll see when I mix it up how little amount of pigment and little amount of binders you use, and you have this pan of paint that lasts forever. So it's super, super affordable and super quick and easy to make. So I think I'm going to flip my camera over to show some of the supplies we're going to use, and then we'll go from there, and feel free to yell out questions as we get. How's that, Pamela? I can't really see.
Perfect. Looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so I don't know what supplies you guys have, but this is our natural watercolor kit. Comes with instructions on how to make it. It has 7 pigments. We actually have about 25 different natural pigment colors on our website, but these are 7 that I thought would be really great. It also comes with the gum arabic powder, which is a plant-based powder, comes from the acacia tree. And it has, well, I'll just pull it. It has these little watercolor pans. So I'll put this away because I actually have pigment set out. Another tool that's great to use is a palette knife. You could really use any palette knife that you have. I like this shape, but many people use wider ones or square ones, so whatever you like best. A glass muller is optional, but I really like it for watercolor paint. The purpose of the glass muller is to just make sure that every single pigment is coated in the binder and there's no air pockets. So it's not grinding the pigment at all. The pigment's already ground as fine as it will go. The purpose of this is just to coat every pigment, and it's super fun and relaxing. So like I was saying, when you finish making the paint, you can put them in these little pans, which you could put into, they fit into most metal watercolor palettes. You can also, we sell these on our website, but you can fill these little pans and have a travel set. And all over Etsy, there are so many different people making little receptacles for watercolor paint, ceramics, and all types of things. So there's lots of fun stuff. All right, so besides that, these are the ingredients you're going to use. So honey is actually really essential. It's a humectant, which means it helps the paint retain moisture, and it helps so that you can re-wet the paint after drying. It's also a preservative and a plasticizer. So plasticizer just means it increases the flexibility of the gum arabic, because the gum arabic on its own is a pretty brittle gum sap. So the honey makes it flexible. So if lots of people ask us, what if we're vegan and we don't want to use honey? You can totally use glycerin. So that's a very viable option. I actually use both. I put honey and glycerin in mine because glycerin can sometimes help prevent the pans of paint from cracking, and they also increase the flow a little bit. So glycerin is a humectant and a plasticizer, just like honey, and you can get it at pharmacies or anywhere like that. Let's see, clove oil. I don't have any clove oil here, but some people like to use clove oil when they're making gouache because it's a good preservative and it stops the paint from going moldy. So besides that, we have our glass palette, which I prefer for paint mixing. You can use other surfaces, but they just need to be non-porous. So you can use marble or things like that, but just make sure that it's non-porous. It won't absorb in. Sometimes I also use a glass dropper. If I'm mixing up the paint and I just want a little bit more binder, I might use a glass dropper, but you don't really absolutely need that. So I don't know if you guys are painting in real time, but I'll just start the process of mixing and you can go along or just watch.
And Leah, quick question.
Yeah.
If someone wanted the paint to be more permanent, to not re-wet, could they skip the hemectic step?
What do you mean to
Do not add the honey? If someone didn't add the honey, what would happen to the paint? Like
it would probably just dry out and become brittle, and you wouldn't be able to, I'm not talking about the painting to re-wet, but just the pan of paint. Like you can keep rubbing your wet brush in here and reusing it until it runs out. So does that
very
answer that?
interesting. Yeah, so it's just harder to get the pigment out of the dried pan without
Yeah,
the okay.
yeah. It's pretty essential for watercolor to have honey or glycerin. All right, so first step, I'll get a glass jar, any size will do. I'm going to put in 6 tablespoons of hot water. Next, I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of gum arabic. Usually just use any spoon or stick to stir it up, and I give it a good stir, and then I'll put the lid on and shake it a little bit too.
It looks like you're using a 250 ml mason jar right now.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot we're in different measurement. Yeah, I think this is an 8-ounce jar. But it's not that much, so you could use a tiny jar too. But this amount of binder actually will make about 20 to 25 pans of watercolor. So you can see again how affordable this is if you can make 20 to 25 pans of color. All right, while it's hot, I'm going to add in the honey. If you see any little chunks in there, I usually just kind of use a spoon and press it up against the side, just kind of break them up. But another huge benefit of making your own watercolor is that it's so forgiving, this recipe. I know lots of watercolor artists that don't measure any of this. They kind of just eyeball it. So it is really forgiving. Although I would really encourage you to take notes on how much pigment you use with each batch and how much binder, just so you know the next time you make it, like if you felt like it could have used more pigment or it's cracking or something like that, you can just change the recipe next time. All right. Honey, you want to make sure you get liquidy honey, not hard honey. I'm going to put 2 tablespoons. Tough. All right.
And it looks like we have a couple questions here about the gum arabic.
Okay.
There's some curiosity if liquid gum arabic can be used and if there are benefits to using the powdered versus the liquid, if so.
That's a great question. I have always used powdered gum arabic, and that's all we've ever sold. I'm not sure what's in liquid gum arabic to preserve it. Usually when things are made and put into a liquid form, they have to have some type of preservative to keep it from going bad. So I generally will just use the pure thing right from the source. And but I can't say I know what the benefit is of using liquid over powder. It's a good question.
And on that note, how long does the binder last for the watercolors that you'll be making today? Do they need to be stored in the fridge, or does anything need to be added to stop it from spoiling?
I when I mix up a batch, I will put it in the fridge immediately after if I don't use it all in that session. And I have I've only tested up to a year before I've used up the whole batch, so I know that it lasts a year in the fridge. But probably longer because I just used it up before past that time. So you don't need to add anything to it.
And
If you're, oh, go ahead.
once the watercolors are dry, are they stable?
Yes, once the watercolors are dry in the pan, they will last forever. They will never mold or go bad. So I generally recommend that. Some people prefer liquid watercolors, and those will go bad. You can add the clove essential oil to it to make it last a little bit longer and keep it in the fridge, but but it will spoil over time since there's no heavy duty preservative in there. And also for the gouache, that would be preserved in liquid form usually. And so you would want to put clove oil in that and also keep that in the fridge as well.
And would you say just 1 drop of clove oil would be sufficient?
Yeah, one or two drops. All right. Next, we are going to add this with pigment, and we have it. Generally, the recipe is you start with 1 to 1. So for example, 1 teaspoon of pigment, 1 teaspoon of the watercolor base. And it's always slightly different though, based on your preference, because every single pigment, especially natural pigments, are very different in their molecular structure and their composition. They absorb liquid differently. They absorb different amounts of liquid. They dry faster or slower. So it's very different per color. So generally I just start with 1 to 1. That's what we'll do today. So you scoop out. Just going to do 1 teaspoon. Generally 1 teaspoon makes about 1 pan of color, maybe a little bit more. So again, it's different for every color though. That's the basics. All right, now we're just going to start mixing, and we're just kind of bringing the pigment in. Keep bringing it back to the center. If I wasn't going to use a glass muller, I would try to simulate the glass muller by just moving palette knife in a circular fashion while pushing downwards. So like I was saying, some people don't even measure. Some people will just scoop out some pigment and just drop on some binder and mix and add more. And so this is a super, super forgiving recipe. All right, after I've scraped it pretty much into the center, I'll get out the muller. This is my favorite part. It's very relaxing. So some people do figure eights. Some people do little circles around the edges. And then a big circle.
I
Go
believe
ahead.
at the beginning you mentioned that the muller wasn't necessary, but if someone was to use the muller or didn't have a muller and wanted to grind it a bit finer, do you have an alternative option?
If you're wanting to grind the pigments finer, you would use a mortar and pestle or sifting screens. Lots of people who harvest their own pigments in nature have all the tools to grind it down really fine. But yeah, the molar is not for grinding the pigment finer. It's for coating each particle completely all the way around. And I'm not pushing down at all. It's just the weight of this molar that's doing it. So after about a minute or so, I'll scrape, and then I'll scrape back into the center. By the way, this is how you make your own oil paint too. Just oil and pigment. Same technique.
And Leah, will the color of the honey affect the color of the paint?
I have never found that to be true, even for white, although most people don't even make white pigment or white watercolor. But no, I haven't found that to be so.
And it looks like your paint pigments are true pigments, like they're, could you talk about the fastness with the
Oh yeah.
pigments choosing to mix today?
Yeah, these are pure earth. This is yellow ochre from France. It's just yellow earth. And natural earth and mineral pigments are the most light fast pigments on the planet. Some people think it's the opposite because they're natural. They think it'll fade and disintegrate, but it's actually the total opposite. It's the most durable, the most light fast, the most archival, the most humidity resistant of any pigment, far beyond any synthetic pigments. So I'm not sure if you can see the colors I have out, but yeah.
A-
So they're very, very light fast.
And some of the first pigments to ever be found, these were the first pigments ever really truly used by artists.
Yeah, for at least 100,000 years, this is what almost all cultures around the world used. They used earth and minerals, red ochre, yellow ochre, orange, brown, blue and purple minerals, green minerals. So yeah, this has been in use for over 100,000 years by all over the planet. And another, I think I talked about this on the last video, but natural pigments, the particle shapes are very irregular in size as opposed to synthetic pigments are all uniform in size. So when you paint with this, the light will hit the pigment particle and bounce off in many different directions. And it creates this really luminous radiance that you can't get with synthetic pigments because the light will hit the pigment and bounce straight back out. So it's kind of hard to tell the difference until you see it in person, but very cool.
Thank you for
All
that.
right,
Really interesting.
sure. So I think this is about done. Again, it's different for every color and you'll see as you're mixing it. But I usually mix about a minute, then scrape back into the center and then maybe one more minute. So super quick. And of course, everyone does it slightly differently. So this is just my way. All right, so I'm gonna just show putting it into a pan. So one thing that I prefer to do with pans is to just fill it halfway, let that dry overnight, or maybe even 2 days if you want, if it's not dry yet, and then fill it the other half of the way. And the reason is because if you fill it all the way up, it'll take longer to dry, and there's a slight possibility that it could get moldy if it takes a really long time to dry. So sometimes people who live in really humid climates will email us and say that it got a little bit moldy. So just to be safe, I usually just say um, fill it halfway, let it dry, and then fill it the other way. Actually, having said that, I'm going to fill it all the way so I can just use up this paint and have this palette. And you can fill it way up to the edge because it will shrink when it dries. It will go down a little bit.
And the surface that you're working on today, is it palette paper or glass?
Oh, this is glass. You can kind of see my glass palette right here, but it was so dirty and stained that I decided to put this piece of glass on top. So it's just a piece of glass with white paper underneath, just so it could be more visible. But you can get this at any local glass shop. You just ask for a 1/4 inch thick, that's what this is, piece of glass with shaved edges so you don't cut yourself. And this glass I actually found in a automotive junkyard probably 20 years ago. And it's really thick. I want to say it's at least a 1/2 inch thick, and it's very, very old, but I love it. So, but you can get any size glass that you want that fits your studio. All right. So that is that. I'm going to get a little piece of watercolor paper. Can you guys see this? I can't tell what's in
Yeah,
view.
looks like Hanamula sugarcane watercolor paper.
Yes. I just got this sample paper actually from them, and I love it. I wanted to share. This is a great company. They're in Germany, and they're the most eco-friendly, sustainable um, watercolor or just paper making place that I have ever found. So, and they just sent me. We carry their bamboo paper and on our website, but I think I like this even more. The sugarcane paper. No trees used. All right, so do just a very beautiful radiant. Watercolor has actually become my medium of choice for the past couple of years. I've been an oil painter all my life, but the last 3 years, I'd say I just do watercolors. I bring them everywhere I go. It just feeds my soul for some reason, watching watery paint bleed together. All right, so that is that. Any questions so far?
Um, we do have a few more questions in the chat here. Do you mix pigments during this process, or do you only mix colors when you paint? I'm not really
Do
sure.
you,
I'm not sure I understand that question.
um,
Maybe we'll just
oh,
move on.
maybe she means, do I just mix up the paint for that painting session?
Yeah, maybe.
Um, well, for oil paint, I actually do that quite a bit. I'll mix it up just for that week. I'll leave it out on my palette since it takes about a week to dry. But for watercolor, since you immediately want to put it into a container to dry or to seal up, then you make so much that you would just store it.
And do you work with a mask when you're using the powdered pigments?
I don't. I'm just very careful when I scoop. I'm not creating any airborne dust at all. I'm just very careful and I scoop. If you have lung sensitivities at all, you should do what you feel comfortable with. And if, there could be a possibility of some dust coming up. So definitely wear a NIOSH certified mask if you have lung difficulties. My employees in my warehouse wear masks, so they have lots of airborne dust going around, so they all wear masks. But you definitely want to protect your lungs. Even though this is basically dirt, you don't want any type of dust in your lungs at all. So you definitely want to protect it, even if it's non-toxic.
Thank you. And then this question's a great question, and I'm sure you'll have some comments. So the question is the harvesting of the earth pigment sustainable? Are they renewable? Would it not be more economical to use plant dyes such as madder, indigo, and weld?
Good question. We use earth and mineral pigments because, like I was saying before, they're totally light fast, UV resistant, humidity resistant, last hundreds of thousands of years. Plant dyes unfortunately fade. They fade pretty quickly. They're beautiful and I think great for lots of uses. I use them sometimes in my watercolor just to because it's fun, and I've made lots of plant dyes and oak gall dyes and all of the things. So I think it's super fun to make. But as far as creating archival paintings that you want to keep for many, many years, um, I prefer to use earth and mineral pigments. And our pigments, every time we purchase or find a new source, we really investigate the source and make sure that it's harvested sustainably. Their manufacturing process is not harming the earth or the water supply. So we really look into that quite a bit. Most of our pigments come from a quarry in France that's been around for generations, and pigments been harvested from this one spot for many, many generations, and there's still tons left. So it's a pretty abundant resource. We get most of our colors from France and Italy just because they have the best colors in the ground, I think, personally, but they're all over. I mean, there's great colors in Armenia, and Virginia has beautiful uh, earth tones, and we get our micas from Georgia, and I think our blacks and browns come from the US. So they come from all over, but that's a great question.
Thank you for that. And with the topic of mica, can the mica be added instead of the pigments to this recipe for creating mica watercolors?
Yes, absolutely. Here's some right here. Some gold mica, and it makes a beautiful gold mica watercolor. We sell gold, copper, and silver mica, and it's all it's what is it? Very humanely. There's a lot of child labor involved and lots of mica quarries around the world, so ours is not like that. It's a sustainable, humane source from Georgia.
Thank you. And with, say, you were to only fill your palette pan half full today,
Mhm.
what would you do with the remaining pigment until you were to refill it the second half? Would you put
I
it in
would
a bag or?
I would probably get another pan and put half in one pan, half in the other pan, and then the next day mix up another batch and do half and half. Or you could just mix, half a teaspoon of pigment and half a teaspoon of binder if you wanted to do that. You can also put it into a jar and it will still be good the next day if it's a tight jar. I have a lot of oh, I have a lot of these little bottles. I use a lot of little lotion and face creams, and so I clean them out, and I use these a lot to hold gouache and liquid paint. There's another one. So another benefit to watercolor paint is such an easy cleanup, just water, and so nice compared to oil paint. This you don't necessarily need this, but it's all gunked up from oil painting. But this is a razor blade paint scraper from the hardware store, and it's a good way, especially if the paint has dried on the surface. You can clean it up real quick, and you want to make sure that it's an actual razor blade in there because some of the paint scrapers don't have a razor blade.
And
But
just for some clarity, Lisa's wondering, you mentioned that you might add glycerin at times when you're making watercolor paint. If you were to do this, when would you add it? Would you add it when you were mixing in the honey and the gum arabic?
yes, yes, you would. So sometimes if your paint dries and there's cracks in it after it dries, some people will add a little bit of glycerin to the next time they make it to avoid those cracks. Although it's totally fine to have cracks, it's just an aesthetic thing. Like if you were going to sell these pans of paint, and you just don't want them to have cracks on the surface, but it's totally fine to have cracks. And also the glycerin increases the flow and it just adds a nice little flow. But you can just play around with it and make sure you take notes on how many drops of glycerin you added so that next time you can say, oh, I want to put more or less. So you can see I'm just adding, I'm just cleaning off the muller with water. So super easy cleanup. There's also another additive that some watercolor artists use called oxgall, and it's not vegan at all, but it increases the flow also of your watercolor paint. And it's kind of, I just learned about it a few years ago, and it's kind of fun to add in, although not necessary at all. All right. I'm gonna start with the gouache next, unless there's any other questions you guys can think of.
Um, the chat is active today. I love it, everyone.
Nice. All right.
And can you do equal measurements of glycerin in lieu of honey?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. All right. For the gouache, you are going to use the same exact watercolor base that you just made. You can get in any type of other little dish that you want to for mixing the pigment with limestone powder. So that is the only different ingredient for gouache. Gouache is a water-based opaque paint. A lot of people call it opaque watercolor. I used it a lot in college because I was majoring in illustration, and we used gouache quite a lot because it was more of a flat, opaque, vibrant paint. So lots of people use gouache and watercolor together too. So we sell this, and Opus sells this, and it's a limestone powder, but we call it the natural impasto medium. It's kind of confusing, but the reason is because most people buy this to bulk up their oil paint. So they'll mix this with oil, walnut oil or linseed oil, and then they'll mix that with their oil paint, and it'll be able to create impasto like really thick textural techniques on their oil painting. So that's why it's called natural impasto medium, but it's actually just limestone powder. So let's see. I'm just looking at the gouache recipe. So first we're going to mix the pigment with the limestone mixture. Again, this is super forgiving, and you can adjust it each time you make it. So I generally do 1 teaspoon or 1 to 1 of limestone powder to pigment, but I've seen recipes online where they use 6 to 1 pigment to limestone powder. So a lot of pigment and just a little limestone powder. So it's completely up to you, but today we'll just do 1 to 1. I'll do green.
And Leah, for the measurements of watercolor and gouache and all of that, is that information, can it all be found on your website?
Yes, we have, if you go to our website and go up to the search bar, just type watercolor and you'll come to, you'll see a tab that says, I think it says articles. You click on that and it shows the watercolor recipe and the gouache recipe.
Excellent.
And the whole recipe comes inside that kit too. So I'm just doing a loose little quick stir, doesn't have to be really thorough, of the pigment and limestone powder. And then I'm going to do one part of this and one part of the base. So pretty simple. All right, so I'm doing the exact same thing that I did before. So it's basically the exact same recipe except for adding limestone powder. Same process.
And there's a question here. Instead of limestone powder, could you use calcium carbonate?
Yeah, I think that would work. Yeah. It's basically just adding an opacity to the paint. All right.
And would diatomaceous earth work?
I I have never heard of that or tried that. So you could try it. I've never tried that. Good question.
Sounds like we've got gardeners here.
Yeah. Actually just bought some to put on my fruit, my berry bushes to protect them from the bugs. All right. That's looking good. So yeah, the gouache you generally keep in liquid form, not in pans, although people have told us that they have been able to rehydrate their gouache just fine, just like watercolor, but I generally keep it in a jar in the fridge to keep it in liquid form. So you probably don't want to mix up a whole lot since it will mold. All right, one more time. Some people do a lot at a time, though. They might mix a whole pack, like all of this pigment, and make a lot of paint. So it just totally depends on what you want and how much you want to make.
And do you ever mix colors together before adding them into pans? Say to a yellow and a red to make an orange?
I generally don't. I prefer to keep the pigments pure and make the two different types of paint and then mix them when you're mixing paint, just like you would normally mix paint. So that's just my preference. Although you can totally mix pigments. I just find it a little bit hard to tell, be able to tell what color you're going to get because you can kind of see that you can't really tell what you're going to get when you're mixing the powders. So you can definitely experiment and figure out 1 teaspoon of this and a 1/4 teaspoon of this makes a great color. You can do it that way. Just keep track.
And when storing the gouache in the fridge, do you date it? Do you know how long it will last? And can the clove oil be added to the gouache as well to keep its lifespan longer?
Yes, definitely clove and also thyme, actually. Thyme and clove both will help to preserve um, the gouache. And yes, you keep it in the fridge. And I've seen it last different amounts of time with different people, but it lasts less time than the pure base itself. This I know lasts at least a year in the fridge, but the gouache less, I would say, a few months. All right. So this I was saying I tend to put in little jars. This jar is probably too big, but um, I'll just scrape up a little bit of it. And then I'll show you an example. All right. I'm going to get some more paper. Right. So, yeah, this just has a really nice flow. And you can just see that opacity, which is different than the watercolor.
And what's the difference between tempera paint and gouache?
Tempera paint is generally called poster paint usually, and it's not as professional quality. There's usually a lot of fillers and bulking agents in it. Um, but it is similar, definitely. It's a water-based kind of flat paint. So,
And traditionally, if my memory serves me correctly, tempera had egg in it versus gouache, which
oh
is
yeah,
American.
traditional. Yeah, I'm sorry. Traditional tempera is egg tempera, and that's just egg yolk and pigment. So we have that recipe also on our website if you'd like to try that. And that was used, I believe, the illuminated manuscripts, and they're still vibrant today, the same manuscripts made with earth pigment and egg tempera all those years ago. And they're really luminous. Those paints are kind of jewel-like. They're very, very luminous. And that's another paint that you can't store, really. You have to use it. It might last a day or two, but uh, you really just paint what you, or mix up what you want to use right then. But that's really fun to make. There's also another recipe on our site called glare paint, which is made with egg whites. So you can make, you with the same egg, you can make two different types of paints. You just separate the egg and the yolk, or the white and the yolk, and they just have different properties.
Very interesting.
All
And this
right.
this green pigment, what pigment did you just mix in to your gouache?
This one is actually an oxide pigment. So this isn't, let me see if I have terre verte. Oh, this is a terre verte color, which is from France. We also sell this, and it's a natural earth from oceanic deposits, and it's a very interesting mineral source. But this one, we had so many requests for a more vibrant more opaque green that we got this pigment, which is an oxide. And so it is man-made from natural materials. So it's different from the earth pigments that you have here.
And is it found in the watercolor kit?
Yes, it is. Let me see. Yes, it's called emerald green. Also have
Those are big
ultra,
bags of pigment.
yeah, ultramarine purple, orange ochre, burnt sienna, which is this one, yellow ochre, which we used, Venetian red, which is one of my favorite, and ultramarine blue, which is the most amazing vibrant blue. All right, that's all for the mixing. I have one other thing I was going to show you is our another thing that people like to incorporate is our natural acrylic paint. So some people will use watercolors and then use our natural acrylic paint to do touch-ups on top. So this is a new product that's plant-based instead of petroleum-based. It's all natural pigments and bio-based additives. So it's the world's first non-toxic natural acrylic paint, which we spent many, many years formulating. So this one is also available.
Very cool. And okay, so say someone realizes that there's mold in their paint. Can it just be scraped off and will this paint still be usable?
Good question. Yeah, it totally can. If you can scrape the mold off completely, it's still usable.
And Anne's wondering, you have aluminum tubes that are for sale.
We do.
Can the liquid watercolor go in there?
It can. The tubes that we sell are pretty large, mostly used for acrylic or oil paint. Usually you're making some, the tubes of watercolor you buy in the store are tiny. So you might want to buy, though, you can just Google empty watercolor aluminum tubes and you can find those online. So they're a little bit smaller, but you can use the big one if you want a lot.
Excellent. And with the, I guess I'll just ask the question with the wet watercolor in the tube, the small tube, will it have to be in the fridge? Or,
Oh, I see what you're saying. That will help preserve it longer because, like I was saying, if it's in liquid, generally any paint in liquid form needs a preservative or it will mold. Water has, breeds bacteria and mold, and so you will need to put it in there. That's another thing of mixing your own paints and putting them in pans is that you don't need any preservative at all. So
yeah,
nice.
excellent. And with egg, does it smell when it dries?
The egg yolk? What?
Yeah. Yeah, when you paint with egg, when you make the
Uh,
tempera, does it
no, it
smell
doesn't. It
dries?
doesn't.
No? Okay. And the
It doesn't
per
sulfur smell. No.
good question. I love it. Um,
If you put that in, if you stored a jar of that for a day or two, it would start to smell. Yeah.
yeah. And the purple color was ultramarine purple?
Yes.
Yeah. And what is the binder in the natural acrylic?
The binder is a plant-based resin, and normally acrylic is petroleum-based. It's basically liquid plastic. So it's plant-based, and instead of the most toxic part of acrylic paints are really the additives, way more than the petroleum. It's the toxic additives that are put in to give it all different properties, to preserve it and to make it flow a different way and have a certain viscosity and make it dry fast or slow. So most of our work and research was trying to find natural additives that would do the same thing, but without all the toxins.
Excellent. Nice work.
Thanks.
And I'm just cruising through the chat here, making sure that there's any questions left. There's some gratitude coming in.
Hmm.
Should the water be distilled when
No,
working with water?
be filled. If you're making a liquid paint to store for a long period of time, that might help preserve it a little bit longer. But for the pans, you don't need distilled water.
And if using natural unpasteurized honey, it has natural preservative qualities. Will this work as a preservative, or would you still need to add a preservative?
Honey is a natural preservative, but it's not strong enough to preserve it long term, unfortunately. But it definitely is. So you still want to add some clove oil.
Excellent. And Angelica is seeking clarification that the blues and greens are man-made pigments. Are
Yeah, the
man-made.
blue and greens are interesting. They are the blue and purple actually come from one manufacturer in France. They have figured out how to isolate the molecular structure of lapis lazuli, and they've man-make this pigment that's the molecular structure of lapis lazuli. So it is synthetic and man-made, but they affix that pigment onto a natural clay base. So it's 10% pigment on this 90% clay base. They heat it in these huge ovens. And that company also is very sustainable in all their manufacturing practices too. So we're able to create this beautiful, vibrant blue and purple since the natural source is lapis lazuli, which is harvested really unsustainably and horribly in Afghanistan and crazy expensive. And so this is their alternative to having a mostly natural, super vibrant blue and purple.
I really like hearing about that alternative. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing. And
Yeah.
we're at the end of the demo now and the bottom of the questions. So I just like to thank you for joining us and being here with us today. It's been really interesting learning about the process of making watercolors and gouache. So much information you brought to us. And everyone, I just wish you the most amazing day, creative day, and I hope you will try exploring making your own paints and have fun with it.
Yeah, have fun. It's so much fun. It's so relaxing to make your own paint. Every time I do it, it's just nourishing and it feels good.
And like, what a fun way to make paint for yourself and also on the side make a little gift for somebody else. I can definitely see myself doing that. So, once again, big thank you. And till next time.
Thanks. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.